Hey everybody, Cody Crawford here with Sound Planning Group in Kirkland, Washington. And today we're going to talk about how much can you actually spend in retirement. Now, what I'm going to do here in a second is go through a real case study from some clients that came in that are 65 and 62. They are just retired and they're really trying to understand, what is my retirement going to look like? And this may come as a bit of a surprise to you, but most people underspend in retirement. They don't overspend. Now, part of that is the way that we kind of have taught people to save now in retirement, right? It used to be that for our parents and grandparents, most of them had some money saved, but really their pension and their Social Security was what they were going to retire on. Now, obviously, today we live in an age where pensions are becoming more and more rare. Social Security ends up being 30 to 40% of people's income. But what we've really taught people now is save, get this big nest egg, and then you're on your own to figure out how much you can actually spend. And that's become a real issue. Partly because most people, again, all we do here at Sound Planning Group is serve baby boomers. And so their parents and their parents before them, who are, Great Depression babies, have taught them well to save money, to behaviorally just keep your head down, save, don't touch it. But then one day when you're 65 or 70 or whenever it is that you're going to retire, now you can actually begin drawing an income off of that. And again, behaviorally, that's a really difficult thing to just transition to. And what I found, and the way that we're taught as advisors, is for me to ask, okay, what do you need in retirement to pay your bills and do the things you need to do? And for example, maybe someone says, I need $6,500. So we take our software, we plug the numbers in and use $6,500 as the expenses and say, hey, look, good news, you can retire. So what I'm going to share with you today is more than just, hey, you need this amount, you're in good shape, which I would deem, your minimum requirements, but how much can you actually spend in retirement? What is your spending capacity? Again, most people underspend because they are really frankly terrified that they are going to run out of money in retirement. And so I'm going to go through this case study and really teach you how we quantify. And this is what retirement planning is all about, is how do we quantify the decisions that we're going to make in retirement so that we're making a sound decision. And most people don't have a process and don't have a checklist and ultimately don't even know the questions to ask on Google. And if you're doing this by yourself and you love it and you're doing a great job, keep doing it. But for a lot of people, hopefully this is an experience that you can take and get some value out of so that you can start to understand, maybe I can do a little bit more of the things that we were hoping I can do in retirement. Maybe we can go on 2 or 3 other trips. Maybe we can fund the grandchildren's education, because ultimately the money that you've saved is simply money. It's the things that you can do with that money. It's the memory dividends. It's the people maybe that you want to bless. And so I'm going to show you exactly how we do that. And what you're looking at here on this screen is, John and Mary, they are 65 and 62 years old. I've titled this minimum spending plan because really I'm going to show you what it looks like for them. They told me, Cody, we want to spend $6,500 to $7,000 in retirement. They're retiring here in 2025. They want to have a real comprehensive view of their financial picture. They, of course, want to maintain the lifestyle. They don't want to run out of money, right? But they also want to know, are we going to be comfortable with, what we have and what we can take? They don't want massive downturns to affect their retirement lifestyle. And they want to make sure that they're investing appropriately for this current season of life that they're in, not for the season of life they've been in for the last 20 or 30 years. Okay. And so let's first look at kind of some housekeeping items and, what they are going to retire with. So they have about $1.5 million. They have roughly $250,000 in a taxable account, which would be a brokerage account. As a reminder, with a brokerage account, you are only taxed at capital gains rates on the earnings of these accounts. And so for them, they put in $200,000. That means the difference between what they put in and what they have is what they're going to be taxed on. So in this case, their taxable earnings are $50,000. And as long as they've kept that in the account for over 1 year, they're taxed at long-term capital gains rates, which are much more favorable than ordinary income rates. Go check the YouTube video and watch our videos on that to get a little more details. That's not for today's video, but again, they've got about $250,000 in their brokerage account. John has $850,000 in a traditional IRA, and Mary has roughly $400,000 in her traditional 401k. I'm going to skip some of these other tabs and go straight to income. They have roughly, for Social Security, John's going to have $37.50 a month. We're not taking that until his full retirement age at age 67. For Mary, she's 62, remember, and we're going to take her Social Security benefit at age 65. They have a small pension of $800 a month, Mary does, and that's going to be taxed, of course, at ordinary income. Because she's not with the government or with like a school system or hospital, et cetera, she was with a private corporation, that $800 a month will not be indexed with inflation like the Social Security will be. And again, we'll go straight to expenses. I've kept this relatively simple so that you can kind of really understand what we're trying to drive at here. And I'm saying that their baseline expenses are $6,500 a month. As they get into retirement, it's attaching a little bit of an inflation adjustment. So you'll see that what we're trying to solve for here is a net amount of $6,956 per month. And so the first thing as an advisor that I want to do when they tell me this is what they're going to spend is, does that work? Can they actually retire? What is the probability of success that they'll be able to make it? Okay. So I'm going to hit finish here. And this is a wonderful software that we use that helps us quantify this. So again, current balance, 1.5 million, 6,900 in net expenses. And the first thing I'm going to want to do here is I want to test this plan right now. If you tell me when you're going to pass away, I'll tell you exactly how much money you can spend and not have a fear in the world about it. But the reality is, if you're a married couple, 1 out of 2 will live to age 90. And so the way that we like to plan is to take plans out to age 100. Okay. And we're going to test this plan and see how well it does at $6,956 a month. Again, a couple of housekeeping items. I've assumed that they're in a relatively moderate portfolio of 60% of their money is going to be in stocks, 40% in some sort of fixed income or protected accounts. Okay. So not all stocks, not all cash and protected bonds or annuities. It doesn't matter what that is right now, but the rate of return we're going to assume here is about a cumulative 5.5 to 6%. And so what do we see here? We test the plan and 99% of the time it is above plan. What does that mean? So this is going to run something like a Monte Carlo, which essentially will retire John and Mary in every rolling 25-year period, starting from 1870 and ending in 2000, right? So again, the algorithm or the computer will basically pretend that they're going to retire in 1870 and 1871, 1872, and use 25-year rolling periods so that we can get a really broad and actually a deep understanding of all of the different economic scenarios that they might face. In other words, to put it in plain English, are they going to retire when it could potentially be in the same economic environment as the Great Depression? Well, we hope not, right? Or would it be that they might retire in the economic period that, say, started in 1993 or 4, which would give you a completely different set of returns? And so we obviously don't want to plan for the worst. We want our plan to work during the worst times, but we're not going to estimate the rate of return, assuming you're going to go through the Great Depression, because then everybody will underspend in retirement. And we're not going to assume that you're retiring in the most frothy, most phenomenal 25-year period, because that's when you do have the tendency or maybe the higher probability of overspending. And so what we're doing is more of a median example here that's going to encompass all of these scenarios. And so 99% of them are above plan. What that means is 99% of the time they can retire with a net amount of $6,956 and have ample money left when they graduate to heaven. They can actually spend more money than the $6,956. And in fact, on average, it's 56% above the $6,956, meaning instead of being able to spend comfortably that, let's call it roughly $7,000 a month, they could spend over $10,000 a month. 56% of the scenarios, or in 56% of all the economic scenarios since 1870. And in fact, if they were to retire in the very best economic scenario possible, they could spend 355% above 7,000. Now, I vote for that one, but we're not necessarily going to plan around that. This is the box here that I'm more concerned with, or that I'm looking at much more deeply, which is only 1% of the time their scenarios are below plan. And even on average, it's only 4% below. So, in the average case, they could spend a little bit less than their $6,956 a month. And even in the worst case, right, if they retired in the worst economic period, they'd only have to drop their income about 11% below their desired $7,000 a month. So when I see this, what I feel like personally is that $69.56 a month is conservative, and it's probably underspending a bit, right? What we don't want to do is get to the end of our life, look back and say, oh my God, I'm leaving 10 or 20 million, which is not a bad thing in and of itself. But if you neglected to do all of the things that you were planning on doing in retirement, then you kind of look back and say, you know what, I wish I would have done that trip. Maybe I could have paid for business class. Maybe I could have taken the entire family to Italy, right? And so that's how I feel, or this is how I would coach my clients to start thinking about this. And so I can pop over here to legacy and we can look at, now I haven't put any specific legacy goals in here, but what it says is, if you were to retire in the worst case scenario, you'll leave $785,000. This does not include their house. The median is 7 million and the best case is 40 million. Okay. So there's no question here that we feel very confident about their ability to retire and spend a net $69.56, right? But as I kind of talked about in the very beginning of this video, the question is not, hey, what is your willingness to spend at this point? What I want to be able to communicate is, what is your actual ability? What is the spending capacity? If someone said, Cody, I get it. I only need $7,000 a month, but I'm retired. I want to take the money and really maximize what I have. And obviously I don't want to spend so much that I have this probability of running out, but I want to be actually able to do those things that my husband or my wife and I have talked about doing for all these years. And so what I'm going to show you here in the next scenario is, what is the spending capacity for John and Mary? Okay, so we've seen their probability of success with their minimum spending plan, meaning, what they really need to be able to pay the bills, do a little bit of discretionary stuff, but ultimately, kind of the amount that they said, Cody, we really would only need $6,500 or $7,000 a month, and we'd be okay. We talked earlier about the ability to, how do we quantify whether or not we're making a sound decision? And again, most of the clients or most of the people that come into my office, I find that they are underspending in retirement because they don't really have a system to know, oh my God, what if I have an extra $20,000 expense? Really know if I can take that trip to Europe every 3 or 4 years because I don't know if I have the money. And this is the wonderful thing about being able to have some sort of software that is geared toward retirement income planning, so that we don't have to, wet our finger and stick it in the air and hope that things are going to turn out right. We can use math and science and economic context and history to actually give you a very high level, high probability answer. Now, we don't know what the future is going to bring. Nobody does. But this is also another reason why we, and why you as a retiree need to be able to benchmark and update your plan year in and year out. You see, retirement is a myriad of complex decisions that you have to make every single year. And the challenges and concerns that you have today are likely going to be completely different in 5 years. But what won't be different is, are we spending the appropriate amount of money so that we don't blow through our retirement savings and have nothing in our elderly years? And so what you're seeing here is now us looking at not what do they want to spend, but it's what can they actually spend. And we refer to it as their spending capacity or their ability to spend, right? And so you'll see here that on a net basis, it's not $6,956 a month. But what our software now says is that they have the ability, or the permission is a better word, to spend a net amount of almost double what they wanted to spend. And so this does a lot of things. And it's not uncommon for someone to say, Cody, we only really need $7,000. Sure, we'd like to do a couple of other things that go above that, but we're never going to spend $12,500 a month. And that's a wonderful thing, because what does this tell us? We have a lot of padding. We have a big comfort zone here, because you know what will happen, right? You'll have to replace roofs, and maybe you want to do some renovations, or the water heater, or grandkids or your son or daughter calls and says, you know what? I need $50,000 for a down payment on the house, whatever that is. You ultimately don't want to have to be walking around with anxiety chipping away at you and having to, make sure that if another $500, $1,000 expense crops up, it's not terrifying you. Retirement is ultimately about having peace. And so again, how do we quantify this decision? Now I can look at them and say, you might not spend double, but you have an extra $60,000 or $70,000 a year, that if you want to, you could. And one of the most common things is, people plan to do some traveling, and often they say, well, I'd love to go to Europe. I just don't think we have that type of money to go. And so I say, well, let's take a look at it right now. At 12,534, let's pretend that that's what you just ended up. You say, Cody, great. If that's what I can spend, I'm going to. But more often what I do is I kind of model in different things. So for instance, let's go here to expenses. And they tell us, you know what, Cody, after seeing that, we want to take for the next 5 years a $15,000 trip to Europe and the surrounding parts. And so I'll go in there. I'll do recurring. We'll say start it today or start it in 2025, and then we'll end it in 2029. So once a year, we'll adjust it a little bit for inflation. I'll push save. And what we want to do is see how much does that impact that 12,500. Again, you name it. This could be anything. I had someone say, Cody, we want to give $50,000 to our church. Right? How does that impact our long-term spending? So look at this. It goes from 12,500 net to 12,000 a month. You think I'm raising my hand and saying you have permission to go on that trip? Right? So again, it's really about being able to see things clearly, have a process and a system so that we can, using math and science, give you a sound planning answer. What's interesting about this software as well is it gives us these built-in guardrails that says, hey, if my balance goes from 1.5 million to 1.7, that gives us permission to increase our monthly income. Conversely, if my 1.5 goes to 1.1, it says we may temporarily need to decrease it to 11,400. Now, again, they only needed 7,000 net, so them going to 11,400 doesn't really make that big of a difference. The point in what I'm showing you here is oftentimes I find most people underspend in retirement because they've never really been able to quantify their actual spending capacity. If your advisor, or if you're doing it yourself, is just plugging in your required expenses and you're basing your retirement off that, it might be a mistake, and it might be something that you regret later on in the future. Again, I'm sure you could find many, many different things to use this money for. And again, the money is just the money. It's what we use the money for that gives us fulfillment when it comes to how we choose to retire. Now, there's many ways to stress test these. There's some other planning items and tools that we will do just to make sure that we're dialing in these numbers. But if we go back here to test plans so that we can understand what my new probability of success is if we're spending $12,000 net a month, because if it says you have a 50% chance of having zero or your plan not working, then that's obviously something that we need to look at. Okay, and so we've tested their ability to spend now. And what we find is instead of having it 99% and 1% like the previous one, we see that still 81% of the time, it's actually above the $12,000 net. And in fact, on average, it's 24% above that. In the best case, meaning, again, if they retired in the very best economic time frame in history, they could spend quite a bit more. But again, we're not going to plan like that. I told you earlier that the box that I'm most interested in looking at is this one. So now this is, on the surface, looks like a pretty big number, right? In fact, hey, it says almost 20% of the time we're below plan, right? However, when we get a little more granular, it says that on average, it's only 5% below that $12,000 net mark. Well, remember, they wanted, or they could get by spending about 7,000 net. So 5% below 12 grand. Remember, we included 15,000 a year for trips over the next 5 years. And even in the worst case scenario, and it was 20% below $12,000. So what that means in plain English is that if they retired in the worst time in history, then instead of being able to spend 12,000 net a month, they can only spend roughly 9,500 or around 10,000. Again, still 30 or 40% higher than what they said that they needed in order for the retirement to work. Now, of course, if they're spending much more money, their legacy is going to change. And again, this rate of return matters and the economic time frame matters. And again, the worst case, they're going to leave $261,000 to their heirs. Now, this wasn't a priority for them, but I tell you what, that 261, they're going to look back and say, we sure had a heck of a time spending our own money in retirement, right? Because guess what? If you leave too much, if we come over here and they leave $8 million and you didn't actually spend that money in retirement, your kids will buy the boat. They will take the trips. They will pay first class. And, they'll probably do all the things that you said you were going to do in retirement and never did. Right? So it's a lot easier to spend other people's money. And so again, you see a lower legacy, but for them, they don't care about that. They wanted to make sure that every dollar they had, they really maximized what they were going to do in retirement. Now, guys, this was just high level. We have videos and we'll continue to do educational videos on, how do we make sure that we're withdrawing from the appropriate place first? Should they have, taken from the joint account or the IRAs? What do Roth conversions potentially look like? Is 67 and 62 the right time to take Social Security? We have videos on all of that, and we'll continue to teach on that as well. But again, to summarize this video, travesty it would be to spend your whole life saving, but then you found out you drastically underspent in retirement and didn't get to do all of those things that you wanted to do.